Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a quick reminder to my students before we get started, please release your videos so we can see your beautiful faces um, and so we can all welcome you to today's class and our special guest. Uh, to those that are viewing via live stream or have joined our class, my name is Tony Rivera, and I am the proud conductor of the Santa Clara University Wind Ensemble and have the distinct pleasure of teaching music history and music theory at Santa Clara University. This particular class, Introduction to Music Listening, focuses on Western music. And Western music uncovers genres and styles of European based or European genesis of music. So that includes your composers from anonymous chant composers all the way through to post-romantic period. But there is a section within this particular class that talks about American classical music. And American classical music is kind of, to me, a very loaded term because you have to define what American is first. And if you trace back our history, I think it's appropriate that we talk about Native Americans and then all the other cultures that came to this country. But there's another culture that has been here, part of the American tapestry, so to speak, and those are those that were enslaved and brought to the United States or the colonial America. And we have a very special guest in that we're delighted for Rhiannon Giddens to share her knowledge and her experiences and expertise and the music of these enslaved Americans, Africans that were brought to America, and what impact do they have. And I'm going to stop speaking because that's not the point of today, and would like just to say a quick welcome to those that are joining us. And it is delighted for me to welcome Rhiannon Giddens.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for letting me sit in for a moment here. Now, I will say that we are going to be taking a short detour from classical music. I interpreted Western music as other things as well, so I hope that's okay. There's definitely an impact African Americans had on American classical music, but I have focused on the impact on American music in general, and there's aspects of things that we attribute to African Americans, like spirituals and blues and jazz, that have shown up in many classical, or what we would call classical compositions. But it's as a part of the American idiom, and so I'm just going to break it down and go back to the beginning, because I feel like before we can even have that conversation, we have to talk about the absolute central place that African Americans have in the creation of American music, period. And for me, I start with the banjo. That's just kind of how I talk about everything, is through the banjo, because for me, it is the perfect emblem of what American music is. So if that's all right, we're just gonna I've made this little what is it called? Keynote. Thank you. It's a how do I play this? There we go. I'm just a banjo player, y'all. I'm moonlighting as an instructor here. So we don't often think about the banjo as a Black instrument. We actually never think about the banjo as a Black instrument. It's As I grew up, it was a white instrument. It's a hillbilly instrument. It's what they play in the mountains. It's something that white people play. I never considered it as an instrument of color at all until I started playing it in my 20s. And then I learned that not only is there an enormous history behind the banjo, there's also enormous history behind American music in general that is not told, and it is left out of the narrative entirely. So this is not an image that you often see with the banjo. This is an illustration from 1856. It's by William Sidney Mount, and he was a great American painter, and he documented quite a few musicians during this time period, including African American musicians. This would be during the time of slavery, although there were free people of color in the North, particularly. But what we're going to find is that once you start digging into the history of the banjo, you start digging into the history of an entire musical subculture that from which everything that comes out of American music really comes from. So I just wanted to start with this image because it's a very sympathetic image of an African American at a time when you didn't see that very often. It was, usually you'd see caricatures. And the image of a Black person with a banjo at this point was very, very common. But something that is as realistic as this, you even know what his job is because you see what's hanging from his neck is that little pin down there. And that's probably because he was a coachman. And so that's what he would use. So these are the, details. These are actual people. These were, not just nameless, faceless folks. So, but we want to go back to Africa because that's where it all starts. So in West Africa, you have a whole selection of lute instruments. We're often talk about the drumming of Africa and West Africa, but actually there are so many stringed instruments that came from the Middle East and kind of came down around and also went up into Europe and affected music there, talking about affecting classical music in Europe and during the Renaissance. But here we have things like ngonis and buchundus, and we have the akonting, which are a family of gourd lute instruments that then when folks came to the Caribbean and in South America. But before we get there, I want to just show you. This is a guy from Senegal playing one of these instruments, just to kind of start off with some sounds and images. So what you see here is that he has, well, this is a 3-string instrument, but the important aspect of it is that there's one of those strings is a short string, which makes it a drone string, which means that it's always going to be in one particular key. So what it does is it means that it's always going to be in one particular key, and it also means there's going to be syncopation created with that 5th string. And you can hear it in how he plays. He's playing with 1 forefinger and a thumb. So he's striking the strings with the back of his nail, and he's pulling that 5th string with his thumb, which then if you go to, this is a modern old time player from the South, from Western North Carolina. And he's I'm gonna skip forward. He talks, he's a talker. So let me get back to So I don't know about you, but I see a lot of similarities there between those two players. One, of course, is a modern player from Africa, and this tradition, it goes many, many years back. The accounting tradition is a folk tradition. It's not a jelly or griot tradition like the Ngoni, and so these would have been regular people playing these instruments. And I met an accounting player named Daniel Jata, and he told me a story that his family, like it was passed down in his family, that you don't go out at night into sort of the trees and play like near the shore and play the accounting, because the devil will get you. And this is all the way back to people being abducted. People would go play, and they would be abducted to be forced to play on slave ships for the enslaved in the cargo. And there's documentation that happened. So there are these really deep connections to this instrument and to the other instruments in the area. And I can see them, side by side. I went to Senegambia and I studied the accounting, and I already knew how to play the banjo, and I was amazed at how the left hand was the same. So how did it happen? So that's the next question. And so this is the oldest banjo in the world that we know of, and it's from Haiti. It's in a museum in the Netherlands, and I was able to look at it. They couldn't take it out and let me touch it because it's very fragile. But I sat in front of it and I played some of the earliest music written down by Africans in the New World. This was in the Hans Sloane document. I can't remember the year. It was like 16, no, 15. I'm really bad with years, but very, very long time ago, during obviously slavery times in Jamaica. And so I took that piece and I kind of added a couple parts to it. And then I played it in front of this banjo just as a kind of a connection, a diaspora sort of connection. So, yeah, so it's in the Netherlands. But I think. So it was 1688. I've been told. So you can hear all of the syncopation that comes from the fifth string, from the playing style, from the fact that this music was often played for dancing. The drums and the accounting are played together in a lot of places. They were when I was there. And so this idea of rhythm and strings and then singing all of that together is not necessarily in the European folk tradition. You sang ballads, you played instrumental tunes, you had songs, but you didn't necessarily have instrumental tunes with words on top. But you notice the player from Senegal and the player from North Carolina, exactly the same feel. And so I firmly believe that is something that comes from the African tradition. So it wasn't just the banjo. So the banjo was known as a Black instrument for a very long time. It was known as a plantation instrument. It was known as an instrument of enslaved people. But of course, it spread, and free people of color played the banjo. White folks started playing the banjo. More on that in a minute. But the other part of the equation that can't be forgotten is the fiddler, the Black fiddler. And these guys were super important to the creation of American music. I don't need to read all of this out, but this is a really great quote by Phil Jameson, who has done a lot of pioneering work in where fiddle and banjo music comes from. So the idea is here that Black fiddlers were always providing music for functions. And the thing is that a function musician was a servant. Is the same class as a servant. So an obvious fit for an enslaved person, especially when even at this point, Europeans are going, oh God, Black people are really good at this music thing. They're so naturally talented. They're very, very condescending and pedantic when they talk about African musicians as if nobody ever practiced or had, complex systems that they learned by ear instead of writing it down. I mean, it's a real paternalistic Western point of view, but it's kind of some of the only writing that we have about these musicians. But there were white fiddlers, obviously, a lot of fiddle traditions coming from Europe, but there were also African fiddles. There were one-string fiddles that were everywhere, and there would definitely have been, that idea that this is a thing, and oh look, this has 4 strings. We know what to do with this, So this is a huge part of this. So as early as the mid 1600s, Black fiddlers were playing for both Black and white dancers. This is important. They're playing for everyone. Right. Whereas you would have white fiddlers, but they wouldn't be playing for Black dancers. I can tell you that, they'd be playing for their own, family, whatever. But then you had, let me finish this. Black fiddlers were playing for both Black and white dancers at street celebrations in the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. And by 1690, slave fiddlers were routinely providing the music at plantation balls in Virginia. As elsewhere, dancing was the chief form of entertainment on the eastern edge of the North Carolina Piedmont. And in the early 19th century, every town and village had its ballroom, and its musician was almost always a Negro fiddler. So Black musicians are playing for themselves, and they're also playing for the white folks who are either owning them or paying them. And then, and in doing this, they're learning European tunes, and then that's mixing with stuff that they're already doing and coming up with. And so from the earliest moments that African musicians are setting foot on the shores, they're starting to combine Africa and Europe in their music, and then the white musicians watching take it, and then they sort of start to change it, and then it kind of goes back and forth, and you'll find that's the absolute root of everything that comes out of America, is this sort of cultural exchange back and forth. But more often than not, the genesis and the innovation is in the Black culture as they use European tools, European modes, and then make something new. And then it begins this journey. So it happens very much with the banjo. This is a great example of a Black fiddler. This is Howard Armstrong. His nickname was Louie Bluey. He died at 92, but he was an amazing musician, but he was like really in the old style of the function fiddler. Like he talked about playing for parties. He's like, I don't care what the music was. It was Chinese people. We learned Chinese tunes. They learned whatever it was that the people who hired them wanted them to play. They learned it. And that was a particular facility that Black string bands learned how to do because of the position that they held in American culture. So here's a little bit of him. I love this combination of this.
Many people didn't know, especially those in the cities, that Black people, Black musicians, string bands, whatnot, played country music too. And we used to play hold downs and all that sort of music, like Ida Reid, John Henry, and Cat in the Hand. That's really a hard number to do.
So there, you got a lot of stuff going on. You've got, obviously, these are folks living out in the country, but Howard Armstrong was from Tennessee. His first group was called the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. He was in the string band with his brothers, and then he made it to the city. And obviously, his music runs the gamut from country to jazz. But here you also have the woman at the piano, syncopated stride piano. Like it made like all of the, and that's coming out of this interesting black white mix, but obviously with that heavy syncopation in it, what he's doing on the guitar. There's just so many layers in this one scene. So that, you know, so we have the Black String Band, who they played for dances on the plantation, in the big house, but also in their own house. And this is really important, that, you know, there was all this transition that was going back and forth constantly, you know. Riverboat and steamboats, which is where where Black musicians were mixing with other folks. They're mixing with working class white musicians. They're mixing with Irish, a lot of Irish musicians in the cities, and also all along the riverfronts, because that was one of the places where people could have some relative freedom in terms of working the boats. And it was a very, you know, there was some sort of interesting culture that was being developed there along the riverways. And then the rich people, like the resort hotels and all of these, you know, all of these kind of things. So, you know, the idea of the fiddle and the banjo being together was like very, very old. As early as 1756, a fiddle and banjo were played along with the tambourine and drums as accompaniment to singing and dancing at an African-American celebration in Newport, Rhode Island. Right. So we also have to remember that the African-American community was not a monolith, that there were enslaved communities in the South and in the mid-Atlantic, and that type of slavery was different. You know, people's experiences were different. And then you had free people of color in the North. I mean, you had slavery in the North as well, but you have like well-established communities of color that were freed the entire time, you know. So there's a lot of different experiences that are happening here. And they're mixing in all of these different ways. So this is the last. So Louis Bluey died in 2003. Joe Thompson, the man on the fiddle there, he was the last traditional Black fiddler in the South of the old school, and his music has been traced back to the time of slavery. Like like the guy who taught him, and so on and so forth, has been established. It goes back to an enslaved musician who bought his freedom with his fiddle. He freed himself by playing functions, and then he freed his family, and then they became a band, and then they became an enormous influence, Frank Johnson, throughout the entire South. And when he died, there was this enormous parade and funeral for him. So that's a lot of history that has been hidden. You know, his music was so popular, people called it Frank Johnson music. They didn't even call it string band music, you know. But Joe is a direct oral descendant. So this is all being passed down in oral tradition. And I got the opportunity to learn from Joe. So I sat with Joe and learned his tunes. So now I am in that tradition now, going back to that time. But this is, they're, you know, in their older years at this point, but this is Joe and his cousin Odell. Oops, no, how do I go back? There we go. So Joe and Odell played, and his brother, before Joe played with his brother Nate, they played for all the square dances in his town of Mebane, North Carolina, which is where my family is from. And they played for the white and the Black square dances. So he's literally a direct descendant of these folks. And we always used to try to ask him, Joe, what was the difference between the white dances and the Black dances, but he would never say. He just said there was one. And they also called it frolics. They called it frolicking instead of a square dance. So there's, and then this is from a series of recordings and videos that were taken and film taken between 28 and 35. And so this is kind of what we consider square dancing at this point. this is the image that we're, I think, very familiar with when it comes to square dancing, is the couples doing figures, and there's a fiddle and a banjo. It's all white people. They're all in hillbilly outfits. They're all in their kind of overalls and this kind of thing. This is something we're very familiar with, very comfortable with. But when you look at the history, this kind of dancing, which does develop, it's a combination of European set dancing, African-American innovation, and also native steps. So it's like what we ended up with is a mixture of all three things. We just only ever talk about the European one, right? So it wouldn't exist without the other two. And actually the African-American component is enormous, because what sets square dancing apart from the quadrilles and the things that it's based on in terms of the figures that come from Europe, that come from England, France, England, Ireland, Scotland, the main difference between that makes it square dancing is the calling. So there's somebody who is calling the figures, right? So that, and you've heard it, round, here's your partner, round and round, grab your partner, all this up and down, all that kind of cornball stuff that we kind of consider really hokey. This was innovated by African Americans, because you have people who are dancing, you have, nobody knows how the steps go anymore, because all the dancing masters are gone, or they don't come over from England anymore. And then you start having the musician call, and then that trend that migrates into one of the dancers is the caller. So you saw this, and now this is a very old film from 1914. It does not have music, but people don't always recognize what this is. This is a set. This is in their figures, and you can see it when it happens. Yeah, I wish there was music. I'm dying to know what it sounds like. But you might notice a difference between this dancing and the dance that we just saw. The guy in the top is the caller who's facing us. You can see him calling the figures. And that's going back around to the by right. And now it's a swing. I used to call dances, so I know all of these things. Now, Joe used to call this like cutting the buck. It's where you'd stand and you'd show your best moves, as part of the dance. So I think those are more sort of African-American inflections into this kind of thing that kind of get ironed out and sort of turn into a different tradition in what we just saw before. This dude is getting it. So it's an important piece that is like held up as like the quintessential white American art form, fiddle, banjo, and square dance. And yet, African Americans are actually inextricably, you can't take them out of the creation of this art form. And that has gone on, of course, and is part of Aaron Copland's work in the classical realm. All of these things show up in American classical music in spades. They show up a lot. These are all innovations that come from, in part from the African American community. And just so that the Black string bands were anything and everything. So this idea that there was a set kind of order is not really true. Whatever they could play, they played. That's actually Howard Armstrong's band with his brothers, I believe. So here's a group, entertaining a resort hotel. They're all kind of looking on, going, "Oh, give us some music." You've got any kind of combination. This is, and there used to be actually a lot of accordion, concertina playing as well in the Black community. That has died out, except for in Louisiana. And then that's us. That's the Carolina Chocolate Drops. We, studied with Joe Thompson and sort of became, an extension of him and tried to play his music wherever we could. So that leads us to the next aspect of American culture that is pulling from the enslaved experience, which is blackface minstrelsy. Now, unfortunately, it's something that we don't like to talk about because, well, it isn't pleasant, but it's really important musically speaking. Now, imagery speaking is also very important because of how, you think about minstrelsy, it in 1843. Now there were minstrels before 1843, kind of single folks, like maybe this guy just goes and entertains on his banjo, talks in dialect, and puts on the wig and the blackface. But then you have the first minstrel band, and this is tambo, fiddle, banjo, bones, which of course we know were being played together in a group by Black musicians 100 years before, right? So, but this is the first sort of commercial American music that becomes a smash. People start going nuts over minstrelsy. They travel to England. It causes a craze there. It's spread to Australia, basically any of the colonies, English speaking places in the world, minstrelsy, and also other places too. But, I know most about the English speaking places. And the music that's being played, this is the important thing, is that this has become the backbone of many pieces of what we consider folk music. So all of these songs and more, Blue Tail Fly, Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, Dixie, Old Kentucky Home, Oh Dan Tucker, Turkey in the Straw, I've Been Working on the Railroad, and tons more. There's songs, and these also, there's pieces of classical music that have been based around these songs, choral music for years and years. The first time I saw The Boatman, which was originally De Boatman, was a Copeland who did that. I can't remember. It was an art song. I saw baritone singing it in conservatory. So these pieces have also kind of made their way into the classical repertoire. But these were all in dialect. They were all very offensive. They had the N word. They were like all over the place in terms of this really awful characterization of this imaginary Black person. And they've been over the years cleaned up and changed. And, now there's lots of Jimmies and buddies instead of the other words. And they've become sort of the backbone of American folk music. But it's really important to know where they came from, and how they were used, and how they were, they contributed to the idea of African Americans as a subclass, in America. Whose face is it? And then, of course, after emancipation, African American entertainers want to, that's one of the few jobs that's open to them, and they still have to black up. They still have to be a part of minstrelsy to get jobs. So it becomes a subverted art form in the African American community, but that's a whole nother lecture. So we just to mention really quickly, talking about not just musically speaking, but these images of enslaved life, which are, as everything that is an exaggeration, they take bits of the truth and they turn them into weapons, and it turns into a lot of negatives. But here you've got Bugs Bunny and blackface, and the creation of Mickey Mouse comes from Bosco the Ink Black Kid, which is basically based on a blackface, character. So it's kind of shot through every aspect of American culture. We just don't even know it. And so that I just always like to mention that, because I just, there he is with the banjo. There's Elmer Fudd with the tambourine. It's minstrelsy went underground when it kind of went out of fashion at the turn of the century. And then it sort of popped up in our cartoons and our comedy shows and lots of things. But again, that's a whole nother lecture. So just to, bring it back to this cultural exchange that's going back and forth. So you have, these are just images of the banjo, more what we consider the normal place, in the mountains, as bluegrass, as folk revival music. But then there's also the city banjo. So it was the backbone of early jazz recordings, because the banjo was very loud. And so when people ask, where did the banjo go in Black culture, it morphed, it changed. The guitar came along and there was more strings. A lot of Black folk moved to the North and to the Midwest, and the music was changing and becoming more, fast, and chord changes, and guitar is a lot more handy than a banjo. But then you start getting a 4-string banjo, and it's just this backbeat of early jazz. So it's still, even in the Black community, was still being used. It's string banjos. New Orleans jazz uses the banjo. Don Vappy is an amazing modern Creole jazz banjoist. And then you have this interesting infiltration into other aspects of American culture, like the banjo orchestras of all of the Ivy Leagues. So people would put classical music on banjos, and they would play, and also popular music of the day. So there you have an instrument born out of slavery and out of people surviving in this extremely difficult circumstance, ending up in Harvard, as part of a banjo orchestra. I mean, the banjo went everywhere. Wellington, New Zealand, all lady banjo orchestra, so the banjo was, kind of like 100 years before rock and roll. The banjo sort of took the world by storm, the English speaking world by storm. So then it brings us to kind of what we consider, a lot of people, this is where the banjo starts, is bluegrass. And by the time bluegrass comes along, the banjo is starting to be forgotten as a Black instrument for various reasons, which I'll get into in a minute. But even in this realm, all the first bluegrass, musicians freely acknowledge their debt to Black musicians, So before we get to that, because I'm going to get to that in a second, just to kind of give an overview, 1600s to 1820s, the banjo is a Black Afro-Caribbean instrument, and it becomes what it is as a recognizable new Creole instrument in the Caribbean. And then it moves up. A lot of folk came to the South, not necessarily across the ocean, but from the Caribbean first. So the instrument and this kind of mode of music moved with them. And then you have in the 1820s to 1900s, the banjo is a Black instrument. So it's seen as an emblem of being Black, but it's not necessarily a truth teller in the hands of these white, instrumentalists. And then you have the 1920s to the present, banjo is a white instrument, bluegrass folk. People have largely forgotten the origins. And so just to show you actually, what it was in terms of who was playing it and when, it actually, you see the actual just overview of it, and how long it was a Black instrument, and how long it was both playing it. It's just because now it fell out of fashion, or was taken, or was erased, from the Black community around the time of the recording industry. So what's recorded is remembered. And so before this, you have to rely on written sources and a lot of digging and a lot of academic work. And luckily that's now been done, but it hadn't been for a long time. So it was very hard to piece this history together. So, you have the birth of the recording industry and the beginning of the segregation of American music. This is really important because up until this time, American music was very fluid. It was very much, there was a lot of borrowing, going back and forth. There was traveling musicians being affected by regional music, and all of this stuff is going on. And then the recording industry comes in and it starts to put things in boxes. And so then when something's in a box, it's really easy to say, well, it's this way, it's not that way. And then it starts to do that. So this is really good. I don't want to read it because I don't want to run out of time. And I want to make sure there's time for questions, comments, that kind of thing. Is that all right? Can we do that? Okay. So we have the recording industry, the segregation of American music. People had regional music, but then as soon as record executives come in, they want to sell music. And so they start going, well, Black people like this, white people like this, so we're going to create these categories. And that's what they did. And so what happened is that people who liked all of it, you just start kind of being shuffled into a box, and that includes the musicians. So, if you're trying to get recorded and you're a Black musician who knows a lot of hillbilly tunes, quote unquote, you're going to learn some blues because that's what they want you to play, So all of these things are happening at the same time. And also you have the good old white supremacy. It's a big piece of the puzzle. folks were pushing back against this jungle music, quote unquote, of blues and jazz, and going, well, we have this old time and hillbilly music. That's ours. That's white music. What is white anyway? You know, every white person who came to America came from somewhere else, and all of these different groups, you know, so they become this sort of white, which is, what does it mean? So this is an attempt to create what does that mean culturally for white Americans, right? So and we already know, of course, the origins of square dance calling are in the Black community, that Black musicians would have been a part of all of these barn dances in a lot of places, you know. And you have these folks who are very interested in supporting a white American culture, comes straight from England, was not affected at all by anybody who was here, and then it lived untouched in the Appalachian Mountains, pure, just like it was hundreds of years before in England. I mean, this is the stuff that people said, you know, and they weren't interested in Black musicians at all. Like Cecil Sharp, who's revered in England for his song collecting and the folk society and all of that kind of stuff, hated Black people. Just straight up did not like them. It's in all of his diaries. You know, he was like, they smell, they're not cool, I don't like them. And he called them N-words all the time. He didn't record them. He wasn't interested. There were Black people living in the Appalachian Mountains, and he would completely ignore them. And this quote is great. You know, we'd gotten all the way up to see this family, and then we realized they were Black, and we had to go all the way back down. Waste of time. He didn't even record them, you know? And so it's just like, what's recorded is remembered, right? So we have to remember that not only are people recording what's there, they're also recording what they think is there. So their lens is shaping how we come to learn our history. So that's why we have to dig, and I'm really grateful we have these diary entries, because otherwise you'd think, oh, there weren't any Black people living in the Appalachian Mountains. And there were, you know, up to like 10, 20%, you know, before the Great Migration. So this was like, you know, and then Henry Ford was totally racist, xenophobe, you know, the car man, and the creation of folk festivals was in a large part very white supremacist oriented. So you would have the creation of fiddle festivals all over the South, as people are trying to, like, what is American music? What's our music? You know, this is like in the 19 teens and 20s. And then they would forbid Black people to enter. And in a lot of places, people were like, whoa, but the best fiddlers in this town are Black. Like, what's up with that? You know, so this is how it's sort of the erasure happens. Power of media as well. The Beverly Hillbillies, you know, even Pete Seeger, you know, he's the image of the banjo for a lot of people, you know, because he was such a folk icon. People like Mumford and Sons, you know, are like, so it just continues to sort of push down, you know, what the actual history is. And then just a really brief stop at some other places, you know, barbershop quartets. It wasn't until recently that people are really openly acknowledging that barbershop quartets are all based on, the origins come from African-American gospel quartets. Like barbershop quartets are literally like the whitest thing ever. You know, it's like 4 white dudes in a tuxedos and straw boaters singing, you know, these songs from the 20s and 30s in really, really close harmony. Well, they're completely indebted to gospel quartets of people who were formerly enslaved, singing songs that were either composed in slavery or right after, and then mixing that with Western style harmony. The Fish Jubilee Singers were a group like this. They started the Jubilee singing, which was like basically spirituals with Western harmonies, and they were the first Black group from America to go to England. They sang for the Queen, you know, and the only Black music that the English had seen before this, quote unquote, Black music, was minstrelsy, you know, and so they were like, what is this? And so it's just, these are the sort of aspects that we forget about. Rock and roll. That's definitely a story that's becoming more known, but the idea of rock and roll being, I can't get, how do I, back? How do I get out of the full screen. I can't figure this out. Wait a minute. I did it before. Okay, hold on. I just wanted to play. You're still seeing my screen, right? You're still seeing the okay. I wanted to play this for a second. Now, this is, y'all know the guy on the right. That's Elvis Presley. And he is, the icon of rock and roll. And he was hugely popular, hugely famous, made goo gobs of money. And this is his song. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. You're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they say. Okay, and then you have the woman on the right. She's not nearly as well known as Elvis, I'm afraid. It's Big Mama Thornton. She was an incredible singer, and she recorded Hound Dog first. Well, I feel all right this morning now. I want everybody to know that I was the one to say, you ain't nothing but a hound dog when snooping around the door. You ain't nothing but a hound dog when snooping around my door. You can wag your tail, but I ain't gonna feed you no more. Now, one of these people made a lot of money from Hound Dog. It was not Big Mama Thornton, right? Because Elvis was somebody that could sell rock and roll music, but was not. He kind of threaded this needle that what made him safe for white audiences, and this happens again and again and again in American music. But that's not the only part of the story. Elvis himself was from a poor family. He was from a poor country family, and he grew up listening to a lot of Black music and had a lot of influences of hillbilly and the other music that was being played around him. And this song itself was written by, it wasn't like, Big Mama Thornton didn't write it. It didn't come out from some old Black spiritual. A couple of Jewish songwriters wrote that song, after they met her, and they kind of wrote it thinking about her growl and all this kind of stuff. So there's always multiple layers to American music, So, and let me go back to, can I get it back again? Yeah, great. So it's not to say that Elvis was bad, Big Mama Thornton was good. It's to say that the more we learn about how the music came to be, and this conversation that was going on, and the fact that a lot of these aspects were crossing the color line, because these ideas of genres is false, because the music is always the best when it just kind of does what it's going to do. And you have, even in bluegrass and country, Bill Monroe is one of the kings of bluegrass. He's one of the creators of it. And he freely acknowledges how indebted he is to Arnold Schultz, who is a Black musician that he learned from growing up. The Carter family, the first family of country music, they were enormously influential. They went and collected a lot of songs from the mountains, and then they made recordings of them and they copyrighted them. So A.P. Carter went around collecting songs. Well, a lot of time he took a Black musician named Leslie Riddle, because A.P. Carter couldn't write down music. And he would collect the lyrics. Leslie Riddle would memorize the tunes, and then they would create, then they would have the song. Well, Leslie Riddle's name is not on any of those copyrights. Isn't that funny? So this is how it happens, right? Like, he was there. They talked about him. He was there, and he's nowhere to be found. You have to dig to find it. So that's the end. It wasn't exactly, I don't know if it was exactly what you were looking for, but I think all of the idioms that would have come from African-American contributions in classical music, this is the start, and it's like, you recognize all of that in there, but we even have to know, rodeo and all of these pieces that are taken, we even have to know that we were involved in that, the creation of the music that influenced him as well. So that's why I kind of focused on this. I hope that's all right. And if anybody has questions or anything, I think we have a little bit of time before the end, but it was a lot, so I don't want to just like keep on going. I just kind of figured, I can stop share now, I think.
I just wanted to quickly comment for my class on what you just said with Aaron Copland's Rodeo. Even though it's quote unquote classical music, but it's the use of fiddle tunes. And we talked about where these fiddle tunes come from and how everything evolves to the point where classical musicians start borrowing or blending into a different medium or art form, whatever you want to discuss. Even in George Gershwin's music, the use of the banjo is very important to where that comes from, and especially in the folk opera Porgy and Bess, and where that comes from. The one thing that I like being a wind player is in that 1914 video, in the background, there's a flute, a trumpet, and the euphonium in the background. So, where a cross of different instrumental cultures come together, and these people are improvising and playing with what they have, and how that brings on new ideas and new forms. So we'll talk about that more in the class when we get to American music, as the chapters describe it. But so thank you for bringing laying a good foundation of understanding for us when we come to that. I would like to stop talking myself, but ask my students if you have any comments or questions for Rhiannon and what she shared with us today. Oh, hello, students. Okay.
I have one question.
Oh, here we go. First, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. I was really intrigued by the section on how banjo music became kind of transformed into like popularly associated with like white people. I was wondering if kind of during that process after banjos kind of became like white, quote unquote, white music, how did that sort of live on or continue in the African American community? Are there any sort of prominent authors that I guess kind of now that we're more aware of are more popular? If that question makes any sense at all.
Yeah. Well, Joe Thompson, he was kind of a special case. He was my teacher, and he continued playing, until his death, not that many years ago, in his community. But most of this kind of community music making by Black string bands had died out by the war. We were just really lucky that for some reason this pocket in Mebane, North Carolina, he continued to play. But it doesn't mean that there still weren't. I mean, my grandma lived in the country, and I lived with her for the first part of my life, and we watched Hee Haw every weekend, which was like a super country bluegrass show, so there are still loads of Black people who were connected to that music and would play it on the radio. But the Black string band had really shifted into more of an urban setting, and the music had changed, become more of a jazz or blues or whatever. But in terms of the urban, the rural string band, that that had died out in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean that Black people still weren't listening to this music, and there still were players. But overall, that's kind of when it the thing is that, like, the function changes. So when TV came in, especially after the war, it's just in a lot of, not just Black communities, but in a lot of communities, community musicians sort of died out because people started watching TV. They didn't go dance anymore. They turned the tube on. So the music was for dancing. So when that dies out, then You know, you're playing it for yourself in your house, and that's fine, but it's just a different function. Silence. Funny, it feels the exact same as if I was in, you know, in the room looking at all y'all.
Tony, can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Rhiannon. I think it's so important in particular, I feel like, to kind of unearth these histories of cultural mixing, right? And you know, the fact that so much of this music kind of voices the interracial encounter that is America. I'm curious, like, is there, now that these kind of hidden histories are being unearthed, is there any pushback to like the kind of Black history of the banjo in like bluegrass communities now, or in folk communities? Like, what's the reaction? Are these histories now being kind of accepted and talked about and embraced, or is there, you know, what's the reaction?
It still hasn't hopped over to popular culture. That's the problem. You know, within sort of these niche areas, people are accepting it because you can't not, because the evidence is overwhelming. You know, there's Sinful Tunes and Spirituals by Dina Epstein. There's the Phil Jameson book. There's just the scholarship is really there. But however, as we all saw, you guys know that Old Town Road song by Lil Nas X? Did y'all hear that? Is that even too old already to know? I don't know. Music moves so fast. You know, he came out with this country song and hit the top of the country charts, and then all of a sudden they took it off. And we're like, oh, that's not country enough. And I'm like, really? Because like country's been borrowing from rap and hip hop for years. So if it's a white guy, it's okay. And so there was, you know, that goes to show there's still this massive ignorance when it comes to, you know, people were started talking about cultural appropriation. I was like, that's funny, you know. And then, you know, like he shows up in a cowboy hat and people are like, oh, you can't steal white culture. And I'm like, yo, I mean, Black cowboys, Mexican cowboys, country music. I mean, this is the thing that frustrates me, because in popular culture, it's just still, it's an uphill battle. It's like, I bring out the banjo. Sometimes people are like, whoa, why are you playing the banjo? And I'm like, oh my God, like how many times do I have to tell this story? Number one, I can play the banjo if I want to. I shouldn't have to explain it, but you know, it's yeah, uphill both ways, but it's all right.
Yeah.
Now y'all know. Tell your friends, tell your family.
Great. Do we have any more questions, comments from students?
How y'all doing, guys? It's
okay.
I know we're all in our rooms staring at a computer screen, but all good.
Like one small comment, how like when we were watching the square dancing, like the difference between like white people and African American people doing the dance, it kind of just reminded me of like last year there was like that popular TikTok dance called the Renegade, and originally it was like made by, or like it was choreographed by a Black girl, and a bunch of white girls like kind of modified it, and then it blew up in that way. But then it's just kind of interesting how it's this history repeating itself in a different, like in today's age still. So it's just like frustrating, you know?
Yeah, I'm gonna look that up now. That's really interesting. I mean, it's a very deep pattern.
Yeah,
it's a very deep pattern. What happens a lot of times, just like the Big Mama Thornton example, a lot of times these things are, even with that was a composed song, but a lot of the blues that inspired the English rock bands, you know, Led Zeppelin or whatever. Do you think they gave any of that money to to the the folks who innovated that music? You know, it's just like who creates it and who makes money from it are often two different things, but that's the way life is. You know, Edison didn't invent a bunch of the stuff he made a bunch of money from, you know. So, but in our country, unfortunately, it's so tied to race in a lot of ways, the cultural stuff, it just becomes this really deeply entrenched thing. And it's not to say that Black people haven't made money off of music. That's not the issue. It's just the overall larger cultural things, and who is, yeah. And the other thing I just want to say is that there's also a class issue here that we forget about a lot. You know, when you consider a lot of the co-creators of a lot of the early American music forms, they're all working class and it's working class Black people and working class white people creating this stuff together because they're living together, you know, and having to interact and all this stuff. And so there's also this class, this story of class, and that's one of the things why it's important to talk about this, because one of the narratives that's being pushed right now is that, you know, you gotta keep people in their place by fighting each other, basically. But as soon as we realize that actually we're coming together across, you know, across race lines, to create these beautiful forms of music, then we know that that's, you know, that shouldn't be true. So if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. And when we talk about, speaking of beautiful music, a couple weeks ago, we spoke about the dance music, right? And how all in these different instruments came together and they would play these tunes, they would improvise and feed off of each other, and how the human spirit, I think, needs dance as a form of expression. And I loved how today started off talking about dance and movement and how important that is. And so here's cultures separated or removed and displaced and whatever, but dance and feeling, you know, your blood pulse is important, right?
Well, it's also, you see the parallels in the creation of Western classical music in Europe. You know, a lot of those forms were dance forms, they were folk forms, they were absorbed into classical tradition. And also you know, think about the Middle Eastern and North African musical wave that happened with the lutes and all of the, you know, these instruments that came up and became indelible parts of the Renaissance. I mean, but yet nobody talks about that. You know, it's like the instruments just kind of came into being in Europe. They didn't come from anywhere. It's the same thing as, you know, erasing Black creation from the history of American world music. So
yeah,
patterns, they repeat themselves.
Yeah, regardless of where you are, it repeats yourself. But that's one of the things that we did talk about a couple of weeks ago. And now that we're in the Baroque era class, we have Francesco coming in on Friday to talk more about where this instrumental dance music comes from and how it is learned and how it evolved. So we're excited about having that opportunity on Friday. Let's see, I think Marie posted something about recordings and the slide deck be made available, Rhiannon. So I'll let Marie contact you about that and
Okay.
There. Let's see, Christina, is there anything else we need to add before we finish today?
I don't think so. I think someone wrote in from the live stream too. What is the name of the video clip of the Louie Bluey?
That was Cackling Hen. It's from a documentary called Louie Bluey. That's really excellent. It's just really, he's such a character, but it's Cackling Hen is the tune that he's playing there.
Okay, great. I think we're good, Tony.
Thank you. Well, it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. We all can't thank you enough. So everyone, you give a round of applause. Yay! And it's thunderous, yes. But thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rhiannon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Rhiannon.
Bye.